I will restart using my broadcasting voice. Hi, it's Bill Wolff, live from TechBash. Today, we're going to talk about interesting tools that Microsoft has. My history, I've been doing this stuff for about 38 years. And mostly with Microsoft all along. I have a company called Agility Systems, which is basically me. And I do consulting work. I usually do consulting in very large corporations, like Fortune 100, Fortune 500. And I do a lot of monitoring, managing of websites at the current position I have. Take care of about 1,200 websites with 800 servers. So there's a lot of automation involved there. And so I have to have a lot of tools to get my work done. So I'm going to show you some of that today. I'm also known for running Philly.net, and some of you I've seen at Philly.net in the past, and we have meetings twice a month, code camps twice a year, and all of our stuff is now broadcast live and recorded, so if you ever want to see what Philly.net meetings are like, you can see them online. This is my MVP profile, so I've been a Microsoft MVP for 15 years, and you can sort of follow what I did and contact me that way if you want to search. Just go into your favorite browser and search for Find an MVP, and it's easy to find any of us that have that designation. So, we're going to talk about two tools today. And one of the tools is called Azure Data Studio. Has anyone installed that and worked with it yet? That's two of us. It actually had a different name. It was called SQL Operations Studio. So some of you have seen that. Well, they just announced at the Ignite conference last week that they have a major upgrade to that. And part of this talk is I want to show you what the value of that is and how it compares to Visual Studio Code, which is the other thing we're going to look at. How many of you use Visual Studio Code already? Okay, so that's about half. So this is pretty much an introductory session. If you have Visual Studio Code installed, or if you want to download SQL or Azure Data Studio, you could probably get it done over the next 2 or 3 minutes and follow along. It's up to you. So with that in mind, I am going to open up those two products and we'll start going through them a little bit. So I take them and install them on my machine, and I typically have them running all the time. But I put them on the taskbar. Now, first thing to understand is they're not getting rid of Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is still a Windows desktop application. It still has more power, more features. This is designed as a lightweight editor, and one of the biggest features is that it's cross-platform. So Visual Studio Code is available to run on a Mac, it runs on Linux, it runs on lots of different environments. The exact same thing is going to be true of Azure Data Studio. It is written using similar techniques, and it is designed to be cross-platform. Right now, its main purpose is to do queries to SQL servers, but it's going to do a lot more in the future. We'll talk about that. Right now, I happen to be using the light theme on Azure Data Studio, and I am using a dark theme on Visual Studio Code. Where do you get these things from? Well, if you go back to the web pages I showed you, whoops, not that one. If we go back to the web pages, Azure Data Studio, there is a section now on docs.microsoft.com that explains what this is. It was just written a week ago, or a week and a half ago, And so they have the beginnings of some nice documentation. There's a section here called install, and if you go to the install section, it talks about which environments you can install on, and then it has instructions on how to get this installed on Windows. So if anybody wants to follow along, you just click on that and you'd be ready to go probably within like 3-4 minutes. Now, these things are so easy and fast to install. One of the things I do is I manage a lot of servers. And part of my job is to make sure that they're up and running. We meet our SLAs, things like that. So I collect a lot of performance metrics. I use App Insights. I use System Center, collect all the data. Then I make fancy front ends and Angular and some other products to show all the other people that work at my division that all the servers are up and running all the time. Okay, so when you work with how many people manage production servers? It gets interesting. What I do is I actually install Visual Studio Code on all of our servers. I probably wouldn't do that with Visual Studio because of all the DLLs and all the stuff you have to go through, and sometimes it has to reboot. But Visual Studio Code, I can install that on a production server safely, and it just sort of sits in the background. And I consider it, a lot of people, if you work in server management, you would use a tool like Notepad++ or something to edit files. And I actually use Visual Studio Code on servers to do things like edit XML files, web config files, look at logs, stuff like that. So it's useful for that. Now with the addition of this new Azure Data Studio, I would consider putting that on a lot of my servers also, because if you work in a production environment, things are often going to be very locked down. And by locked down, I mean you have a lot of firewall restrictions. So you can't, Can you hear me now? Do you hear me? Excellent. Okay, I am now using the handheld mic, which will greatly affect my performance up here. Okay, so as I said, I'm considering putting the Azure Data Studio on a bunch of the app and web front end servers that's working from that server. I could actually fire that up and do it, and I'm good to go. All right, if you want to download Visual Studio Code, typically you go, they actually have its own URL now. They have code.visualstudio.com. You go there and you say download Windows, and it throws it down and gets you all set up. So let's go into those products and take a look at a couple things. Don't worry about the source code right now. We'll get into understanding of that shortly. So basically, you have a menu across the top, a couple selections. You have a bar down the left that has some fancy icons. Usually have an explorer here, and when you select these icons, it changes the capabilities here. This one is for your file explorer. This is a search for files. This one connects you to like GitHub. And then the next one is deep. And that's much better, thank you. And then the last one, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, is extension. Now, sometimes you may see a different icon on the bottom. Did anybody open theirs up? Do you have a different icon on the bottom of the left? Yeah, so depending on what you're doing, you might see an icon there for sharing, where you can do VS or live coding. So, all right. So now that we have that in mind, let's go take a look at the data product. The data product is similar. It has a simpler menu at the top, and then it has a connection thing where you would actually connect to servers. That sort of makes sense from a SQL Server perspective. It has a task history, a file explorer if you want to look at a bunch of SQL scripts that you have, search all files, GitHub or other source control, and extensions. So the point of showing this is that they're trying to make these two look almost identical so that the skills that you learn are easily transferred from one to the other. On the bottom left, they have a settings gear. And when you right-click that, you can see a bunch of different things. If you just click on it with a left click, whoops. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. If you click on it, you can go to the command palette, you can go to settings. So I'm going to go to settings, and you will see that the settings are done as a series of JSON instructions. It's a JSON file, and there's a whole bunch of things you can do here to set how you want your editor to work, how you want your keystrokes to work, things like that. What they did in Visual Studio Code, and I'm curious if anybody that's following along, I'm curious if you see this, my settings looks completely different now. So in a recent build, they actually made a nice fancy entry screen so you can go in here and adjust your font size, your auto save, your cursor, all that nonsense. And you can go down for all these different features here, and you can figure out exactly how you want your editors to work. So the point here is that people that use these kinds of editors, some of them have been doing things a certain way for many years, and they want their tools to work the way they want to work. So Microsoft has built these things so they're ridiculously customizable. And by changing these settings, now, if you want, you can also go in and open, see on the right-hand side here, there's a little ellipsis. And in Visual Studio Code, you can open settings.json, and you can see the old way that things were done. And they used to have these little groups that they would show. And then you would go down here, and you would take one of these and copy it over to here and save it. That's how you would do your configuration. So they made this a lot more interesting, a lot more fun to work with. Okay. So a little bit about the interface here, and especially Visual Studio Code, they have under the help menu, they have a welcome page. And the welcome page is interesting because it has a bunch of buttons on it, and it lets you do things like create files, open folders, and things like that. But what I like is that they have this thing called the interface overview. And when you do that, it actually highlights a bunch of the areas on the screen and shows you the different keystrokes. Now this gets us into a very opinionated area, but in both products, you can customize a ridiculous amount of things. And you can assign almost anything to a keystroke. So if somebody's a heads-down typer and they like to type code all day long, they can use these keystrokes to speed up their work. So if you learn the keystrokes, certain things like opening a file, doing a search, they're all assigned to some set of keystrokes. There is a command palette, which I'll show you in a moment. The settings is Control-Shift-M, and then in a little while I'll show you the integrated terminal, which they have in both products. Okay, so let's look at settings, which, or excuse me, the command palette, that's Control-Shift-P, and that brings up a little window at the top that lets you type something in. Like if you wanted to do view, you could type in view, and then it shows you all the different options, and you can pick one and run it. The data product does the exact same thing. So you do a Control-Shift-P, and you go up here, you do view, whoops, you do view, and you get the exact same thing. You can go down and they don't have as many things written yet for the data product, but the point is it's the exact same concept and the same approach. So you should be able to find things pretty quickly. Another thing that they use the top bar for, if you want to open a file, if you just do a Control-P, that actually is what they refer to as a quick open. So that shows all the files in my project, and it has a type ahead. So if I want to go look at index.html, I can just type that out and just open that right away. So that makes that easy to do. And I believe they're going to implement the same thing in the data product once you start working with SQL connections. So, since most of you haven't seen the data product yet, let me show you a little bit about that. And I will tell you that I have, on this machine, I have SQL Server 2019. Has anybody used that yet? Just came out a week ago in preview. And it's all right. It works pretty much like all the old stuff. But if I go in here, I can see the version. And if I do something like, let's go into master database and do a query, just to show you that this is working. Okay, so this is what I would normally do in SQL Management Studio. And you'll never remember all of this, but SQL 2019 is version 15 of SQL Server. Okay, so in here I could do queries and things like that. Now, how does the new product work? Well, in here, what I do is I go and I want to make a connection. So if you want to make a new connection, you do this and you fill out a form and you tell it where your database server is and things like that. What I did is I already made a connection to my local host, so I'm just going to click on that, and that opens and shows basically the same thing I saw on SQL Management Studio. Now the difference with this product is I have a lot less capabilities. So if I right-click Master, I can manage and do a query, that's it. And when I do a manage, it comes up and shows me my backup status and a couple other cute little panels. If I were using SQL Management Studio, there's a lot more things that I would do. So it isn't Microsoft's intent to replace SQL Management Studio with this lightweight query tool. It's just to give you some of the capabilities. But I think over time, you're going to see a bunch of these things, like the ability, if we were to go into a database and go into tables. Well, this doesn't have any useful tables, so I will show you how to make a table. Let's go in and take a look at that. So what I want to do here is I want to basically just make a new query. So I could go all the way up to the server and make a new query. And I'm going to cheat and go back to the quick start here. And they have some sample code here and instructions, which you should follow. This is how you learn. And I'm just going to copy this. And just to show you how this might work, first of all, let's run the same query we ran in SQL Management Studio. So you'll notice that it has IntelliSense and type ahead. And I can press F5 to run it, and it gives me the results back. If I type in my instructions here, what this is going to do is actually make a new database. So there is no, in SQL Management Studio, what we're all used to is we would right-click and say New Database, and it would come up with a bunch of wizards to get us started. You can't do that here. You can't do New Database. You have to write SQL scripts. So when you do this and run this, it shows you down here the results in a series of messages. And I thought this is sort of cute. As it finishes each step, you can click those and it actually highlight the code that it ran for that, which is sort of useful. Now over here in databases, notice it doesn't show up, so I'd have to go and refresh, which is typical. That's what you normally would have to do if you were going to be over here. I would have to refresh again, and I would see the database here, and then under the database, these are all the things I can do in SQL Management Studio. In Azure Data Studio, I have a similar set of folders, but it doesn't have quite as many capabilities. So let's go back, and I'm going to make a table. So to make the table, I'm going to copy this. And I'll run that. Okay, and then under tables, again, I don't see the table unless I refresh. And now I should be able to see, oh, made a mistake. What did I do wrong? See if you can spot it. Yep, that was a dumb thing to do. So what I should do, if I want to really clean things up, I should go to tables here, and I see I have customers. I should delete that. So notice there is no delete here. You script is a drop, and then you run the script. And then if I refresh my tables, you'll see that that table went away. So it's pretty useful. But what I wanted to do is, I'll close this window, and I wanted to actually make this table in the correct database. So you have to sort of pay attention to what you're doing. And as long as you're in the right database and run it, then what should happen is when I refresh that tutorial database now has DBO customers in it. So since we are going down this route that everything has to be done with SQL scripts, we'll just copy some rows into there and run that. And then you get to see the experience that you would expect. If I right-click this and say select top 1000, it actually shows me the data in a nice little grid format, which is nice. The other thing I can do is I can right-click and say edit the data, and I can put I'll make up a fake email address and press enter, and that actually committed that row to the database. And if I were to refresh the other query and run that again, you'll see that it now has the new data in it. So it's pretty useful. The one thing I do like about it is this. On the right-hand side here, I can save the data as CSV, but I can also save it as a spreadsheet. So if I click that, it actually makes an Excel spreadsheet, which is handy. And for those of you that are software developers, it will actually save the data as JSON. So you can take any SQL query and then save the whole thing as formatted JSON, which is useful. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to show you is a stored procedure. And a stored procedure comes out, and they use a concept that's very popular in Visual Studio Code called snippets. So the way you would do that is we can get rid of all of this, and we can type SQL. And as soon as I type SQL, it comes up with a set of suggestions. And if I move down here, I can say, yes, I wanted to make a stored procedure. So let's take the results and the messages and move them down a little bit. So that was pretty simple, and this works very similar to Visual Studio code snippets in the sense that once you create your snippet, then there are words that can be replaced. So what you do is we're going to make a stored procedure called get customers, and I have to grab the right place here. It is get customer. And what I have to do is they have this thing called stored procedure name. And if I say change all occurrences, it highlights all the places that exist, and I can put the, oops, that really didn't work, did I? Let me make a new query. Let me start over. Okay, SQL. Create stored proc. Change all occurrences, and what I wanted was get customer. That's close enough, and I press enter. Whoops, not enter. Go ahead, and then the schema name, I would want to change all occurrences of that to DBO. So that's pretty useful. So it makes an easy way for you to edit things like stored procs and things that are very repetitive. What we're going to do is take this and replace it with some real code here. And the fact that I'm working on SQL 2019 or 2017, I can do queries that actually return JSON. So hopefully that is going to have some value to you. But when, whoops, keyword 4, what did I do wrong here? I messed something up here. Oh, because I'm going too fast. Yes, just run the darn thing. Thank you. Run the darn thing, and it actually created the stored procedure. And for those of you that don't believe that, if we go down here to programmability, stored procedures, there's now a stored procedure called get customers. And at the bottom of that script, it actually did an execute get customer 1. Since get customer 1 returns JSON, the JSON appears here. And you'll see this when you get into SQL 2017 and 2019, you can actually click that and actually edit your JSON files. Which, how many of you work with JSON out of SQL now? It's a good thing to do. How many of you work in a bigger company where the standard is still SQL 2008? 2012? But yeah, so you'll have that a lot. But if you have the newer versions of SQL Server, it understands JSON. And since the world of modern dev is all moving to JSON away from XML, they're making that a first-class citizen. All right, so that was sort of interesting. We can do store procedures, we can do queries. Another thing I'd like to do is I'd like to learn more about the cloud. All of you guys want to learn about the cloud, right? So I will show you that I have Azure. And this is my Azure instance. If I go in here and I click, and I have a whole bunch of resource groups in my accounts with different things like functions and Cosmos DB databases, but I also have SQL databases. So if I go over here on the left, you'll see that there is a thing called SQL. And when I click on that, you'll see I made a simple database called TechBash 2018. And that database already has some data in it. Now, when I run that, you'll see that if you haven't tried doing SQL in the cloud, when you do that, it actually takes your database and exposes it with a URL. So TechBash 2018 is now a database in Azure for the time being until I delete it. And I use that, and if I wanted to, I could actually go in here and I'll do a query while I'm in Azure. If I can remember the password correctly. On. Here, I have to click on OK. That was my. Okay. So I got in here, and I go in here, and I can see that I have customers. So I pre-populated this with what's called the Adventureworks database. And I could go down here and I could say, like, let's look at the orders. So I could take orders, and unfortunately you have to like select star from sales LT dot. This is not very friendly. It doesn't have the IntelliSense. But let's see if that works. Whoops. It's got an R in it, doesn't it? Darn that R. Okay, let's try that. Woohoo! So we got some data. And I swear to God, there's data in there. And so the fact that I've just proven that I have an Azure database. So can this new tool be used to connect to that? And the answer is yes. I've already set up a connection, and if I were to go to this connection and manage it, give it a second here, you will see that it has a TechBash 2018 database, and in there you will see that it has a bunch of tables. And I can go down here and I can take my headers and I can say select the top 1000. And there is my data coming from Azure. So I can use this tool effectively, and I can manage Azure SQL databases from a Mac, from a Linux, anywhere I want. So now I will show you a cute trick that is in this tool that is not in SQL Management Studio. Suppose I wanted to take and just return back the TotalDo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select TotalDo from sales order header. Let's run that again. And you see I have TotalDo. And I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with this in the future, but it makes graphs, which I thought was really silly at first. Since this is actually a web front end, and they have the ability, and it makes these really fancy graphs, and I guess once you learn how to query the data and display it, you can take the graphs and then you can copy them as an image, email them to somebody, which is a nice feature. So there's a ton of other stuff you can do with this. I'm not going to go into any more details right now, but I just wanted to show you, it looks like it's a pretty solid product. It looks very useful. One of the nice things, if I have a query like this, I can take my queries and save them. And then I can also take my queries and attach to something like GitHub and save all of my SQL scripts to do source control and versioning, which is nice. Okay. Now, what are some other things we can do with both products that would be helpful to you? Well, the next thing I want you to do is we're going to look at what's called the terminal. So the terminal, and I'll show you, it works the exact same in both products. If I want to view the terminal, I go in here and I see that it's a control backtick. So that makes a terminal window at the bottom of my screen. If I go to SQL, control backtick does the exact same thing. Now, for some reason, I'll just do a dir here. I'm actually technically running a PowerShell window. So I could run PowerShell commands here if anyone knows any that we could test. But anyways, you often use this to do access to the command line and do file management, things like that. But it basically works the same way. Oops. There we go. So they both work. Now, when you're working with the terminal, there's a bunch of keystrokes that are interesting. Suppose you want to look at two different things in the terminal. What you do is a control backslash, and it actually opens up a second window. and that allows you to do multiple back-end things. Now, for some of you, you may think this is sort of like a step backwards, but people that are especially Linux-oriented, they do a lot of things with the command line, and they're constantly running little utilities. So this is built to honor their style of work. And what's good to know is that the exact same thing works on the data product. So I could do net user here and things like that. So like maybe I do a query, export some JSON, I want to go look at it in the command line, I can. Now when you have these windows here, which one do you find easier, what's easier to see, the white or the black? Okay, you like the dark themes. Okay. As you would imagine, they have dark themes here also. So are you happy now? Excellent, okay. So this will be my Azure dark theme for the data tool, and this is the one that's sort of Visual Studio Code popularity, the colors and things they use. Now, did you know that you could make as many of these little windows as you want? Whoops, apparently not. It's limited by your screen space. And if you want to switch between them, you just do an Alt left and right. So you can like very quickly, work on that one. You can go over to this one. And just to make things interesting, you can put them on the side. And that way you can hardly even see your source code. But that's pretty useful. And you could take these individual ones and you could kill them. There's a little trash thing here. It doesn't mean it deleted DOS for you. It means that it just closed that little tiny window there. So I have a little window and I have this little window. And what confuses people, you have to hit this little chevron here. And it expands here and says, oh, well, now if you want to put them back underneath, you can. So basically, you can open that command window, open as many sessions as you want, do what you need to do, and get it out of the way. The other thing the command window allows you to do is sort of not totally full screen, but almost full screen, so that if you want to see a lot of stuff, you can expand it. And I use that constantly, especially doing web development. Okay, so we looked at themes, we looked at the command window. Let's jump over to Visual Studio Code and play a little bit with a project, which I happen to have in here. So this is a simple project. It has some Razor pages in it, and basically, it's got a bunch of HTML code. Now, when you're looking at code, there's a couple things you should be aware of in Visual Studio Code. In a couple builds ago, they released this thing called the Minimap on the right-hand side, so you can quickly move up and down, which is nice. The other thing that's real nice is the thing called Outline View. Does anybody use Outline View? Okay. Outline View is interesting, because watch what happens. As I move around the outline, it jumps around my code. And as I go up and down here, depending on your settings, you click your settings. If you say follow cursor, this is sort of interesting. As I go up and down, it actually follows my HTML outline, which if you're working on a really big page, that could get handy. The other thing is that there are numerous keystrokes to do the following. You can take and collapse sections. You can collapse all the sections. You can go down to different levels. So that's pretty useful. So that's called Outline View. Now, if you don't want Outline View in your way, you just click at the heading again, and it just hides down here. Did you know? Suppose you really like Outline View. Did you know you could take this and drag it up here so that Outline View is at the top? That's a silly thing to do. But you can do it, and you can put it back down on the bottom. Oops, yeah, there, back down on the bottom. You can also take these silly things over here and move them around. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but the interface is completely customizable, exactly what you want. Okay, let's go into the View menu. So there is a thing called full screen. When you go full screen, it removes all the Chrome around the outside so that you can actually work on things unencumbered. And then you, just like you do in a browser, you just F11 and it goes back to normal. Now, has anyone tried Zen Mode? Okay. Zen Mode really focuses in on your code and gets all the other stuff out of the way. And you can type and do whatever you want in here. And it isn't quite obvious, but you have to press escape twice to get out of there. That's called Zen Mode. Now, just to prove a point, does this thing do the same thing? If I go into Appearance, you'll see that it has full screen, which is good. So the data tool works the same way. And it also does the, what is called the Zen Mode. And does the exact same thing. Did you know that you're actually running a, where is it here? Remember how to, yeah, the developer tools. It's under help. Okay. So yeah. So if you didn't know, this whole thing is actually run in web technology. So if I go in here and go into developer tools, you'll actually see that this is actually all a web page. And the fact that it's all a web page, you can do silly things like you could go in here and look at this div and see how it was created, which is fascinating. And then if you do F12, no, I guess F12 doesn't close the developer tools. The little X up here does. But that works on both products too, because it's all web-based. The fact that this is all web-based, another interesting tidbit of information. I did a talk yesterday, and there is a website I use called Code Sandbox. Code Sandbox actually lets you write code in a web browser on the web. The reason I'm showing you this editor in here is essentially the same source code that's in Visual Studio Code because it's a web-based product. And this is called the Monaco editor, and that's how Visual Studio actually gets all this stuff to work. Because they combine that with what's called the Roslyn compiler, so they can actually compile things in the background. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio Code. There it is. All right, and let's actually run something here. Since we haven't run anything, I'm just going to run without debugging just to show you that this can actually run and do something useful. And when you run, it's going to bring up a website, and that's not really the point to see the website. But when you're running, it actually shows you this little toolbar up at the top that lets you pause and break into debug and restart and stuff like that. And then you can stop it by just hitting the stop sign there. Suppose we wanted to actually do some debugging. One of the things we might do is, let's go to the contact page. And in the contact page, let's put a breakpoint. So the breakpoint, just like you would use in Visual Studio, you can put that right there. And then you go to debug and you do an F5, and that'll run the website again. And this time, it will work a lot more like Visual Studio. Now watch the bottom taskbar, if you can see that. When I click on the content page, notice how Visual Studio Code blinks, just like Visual Studio would. And when you click on that, it'll actually show you you're in the debugger, and you can go in here, you can see the value of this. If I step one line, you'll see that message is now equal to something, and we could go in and play around with this and change the value and all. I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint, and then I'm going to say continue, and when I continue, it goes back to the website and everything's fine. So you can use this for debugging, which is pretty handy. There are debuggers for C#, and there's debuggers for JavaScript, TypeScript, all of those other popular web developer frameworks now. Another thing I like to do, I'm going to stop that debugging session. There's some cool things you can do with looking at code. So, did you know you could take the contact page, and let's do the about page. And if I use the click, I can select both at once. And if I right-click that, then I can compare the source code. That's useful. So this is what typically we would call a diff tool. But you can take a look at different files or at different versions of files and see them side by side and actually determine where you want to make changes and things like that. Okay? Now, when I did that, it actually spawned off a second window. So just like I did in the terminal where I created multiple sessions, did you know you can create multiple sessions in the editor? So there are 3 copies of index.html. And that's useful because if it's a big file, I may want to go down here and I might want to look at something up at the top and then, you know, copy and paste from different areas in the file. That's pretty handy. You can get rid of one of them just by hitting the X. But did you know that you can go into the layout? And I love doing silly things like that. So now I have 2 copies of this file. That's index.html. And let's put contact here, and let's put about over there. So now I'm actually working with 4 code editors. Now, on a little screen like this, it's not very useful. But if you have a big monitor, it's really handy because then you can actually, like, how often do you take like a class or an HTML page and copy it essentially into a new one and rename a bunch of things? So it's really handy to be able to have all these windows open and jump between them. And there are keystrokes, Control 1, Control 2, and you have to watch the header to see which one I have highlighted. Control 3 and Control 4. So there is a way to quickly move between the various windows if you're doing this kind of editing. All right. Well, that was sort of fun. So I wanted to show you just a couple more tips and techniques. I got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to go back to help welcome. And when I'm in there, what I want to do is go into what's called the interactive playground. And this shows some nice little tips that are useful. And if you go down here, it shows you in a live session how you might work with some of this stuff. So basically what happens here, if I take something like background color and highlight it and do Control-Shift-L, then what I could do is I could do color, and what I'm doing is I'm actually changing any instance of background color on the entire file to one value. So that's pretty handy. And the same thing here, if I just backspace and pick the original value, it's back to where it was. So that's handy. Now, I would like to point out that this little window here where I'm typing, because of the way these products are built, they're all web-based. Basically, that's sort of like a little iframe that has an instance of Visual Studio Code in the middle of it. That's how they can show it to you while you're looking at a help page. Okay, so here's one where you have a problem, and you see the little squiggle here. which we've all come to know and love. And when you see that little squiggle, what you typically do, you control space, and that is just an example of IntelliSense. So it knows by reading the code what are the possible values, and it lets you pick out the ones you want. That's pretty handy. This is a good thing to know, especially if you're doing a lot of editing of JSON files for data. Did you know that you can, oops, using the Alt key, rearrange your lines very quickly, which is really dumb if you do that. Did you also know that you can, if I do this, I can make copies. Which is very handy for editing. And then if I want to get rid of something, Control-Shift-K is one way to do it. What most of you would probably know Shift-Delete as the keystroke you would use. So that's what they call line-based editing. And this one is refactoring. So if I do something like here and I press F2, what I can do is I can call this paperback, and they all turn to paperback, and then I can be down here. I press F2, turn them back to book, and they all go back. So that's a pretty useful feature. Something like this, I think I had trouble getting this one to work. But what you're supposed to be able to do is extract this, so refactor, and it doesn't, that's it. They wanted me to do this. So you highlight this, and you get this little light bulb, and then you're supposed to be able to click a button, and that takes that, makes it into a function. But I didn't get that sample to work. What else? So, I was just in Jess Chadwick's session, and does everybody understand this syntax in JavaScript? All right if you don't. If you're C# programmers, you're used to doing string.format, okay? So this is the equivalent in JavaScript of essentially string.format. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the variable car and put it in and replace it in this string as it runs. It's iterating over a group of cars. Okay? And the way you make that work in JavaScript is you use a backtick instead of a single quote. And that's called the template character. But basically, what they wanted to show you here is, I think I had already done this one, but if you set a Control-K, Control-F, if you have this all messed up, like you have two spaces here and somebody did that, and it drives you nuts when people like put their comments there. So you take this whole thing, and there's a series of keystrokes, and it'll put everything nicely back for you, which is good. All right. So I'm not going to show you the rest of these. You can certainly go and run them yourself. Oh, this one's useful. How many of you actually use Emmet when you do web development? Have you ever heard of Emmet? So Emmet is a shorthand notation. This is very cute. So here it's saying, I want a UL element followed by 5 LI elements. And each of them has to have an item attribute. So you take that, and you go to Edit, and you say expand Emmet abbreviation. And it turns it into that. There's a whole shorthand notation, and people that do a lot of web page design rely on this. Did you see that it actually took the items and numbered them correctly? Pretty handy stuff. So look that up if you have a chance. Pretty handy. So So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Let me, I'll finish up. I'll just show you one other project that that's a little bigger that I did. I was actually working on a conference similar to this, and I built this really awesome website to run the conference. This is run in a language called Vue. And in here, you can see where this collapsing comes in handy. This is the home page. That's all the stuff for the home page. Now, this is an example of using a JavaScript framework. And this is where a tool like Visual Studio Code is often used. In fact, lots of people that don't use Windows download this product so they can work with React and Angular, products like that. And the way you would do this in practice, if you wanted to run this website, you don't necessarily debug it. What you do is you open your terminal window, and in your terminal window, you type something in, and I happen to know what to type in. And if you ever do work like this, you might be used to doing npm commands, npm start. Yarn is a competitor. It's a little fancier than npm. And what this is going to do is take this big website and actually package the whole thing. And once it packages, you'll see that it actually comes up and says, hey, you can run this now. So you just click click the slash, and there's my website. So I'll show you this with in full screen. And this is the website. This is all done in that JavaScript framework and reads data actually out of Azure Functions, brings in stuff. But all of this was done with Visual Studio Code and all the formatting and stuff. So it works pretty well. So there's a lot more stuff I could show you. We're pretty close out of time. But anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. Not really. What you do here, instead of opening a solution, which is what you're used to, what you would do is you would open a folder. And when you open a folder, this is, here, this one is called My App. And when I see there's no solution file in here, and when I select that folder, it actually opens up. This is a little chart thing. I will show you this one. I was testing some a graphing technology, but everything in the world of modern web development is folder based and not CSproj or SLN based. And I can't really answer your question exactly. I don't know what happens if you open something that was in Visual Studio and then open it with this. I know the two work together. I just don't, I tend to use this more often. And okay, but it won't edit the CSproj, it just leaves it there so that when you open it again. So he said you can open them, but so there you go.
It understands solutions too.
Oh, good. Here, I'll show you my graphs. Gotta love graphs. So that's actually one of the sponsors here, the Telerik tools. I was testing their tools. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, good. What's his name? Oh, one of the Microsoft people. Okay. Yeah, I've been watching the development of this tool for about 3 years through Microsoft, and I'm amazed at what people do with it. And even, you're right, when you go to a conference like this, oftentimes you're going to see the top Microsoft people, and they just use this now. They don't use Visual Studio. So hopefully I got or piqued your interest a little bit. The thing that I would take out of this session is that Microsoft is all in on these cross-platform tools. They are all web-based, and now they have a web/code development tool, and they also have a database tool. And I think you're going to see another more series of tools. The last thing, because I am over time, aren't I? The last thing I will show you is that both of these tools have an extensive set of extensions that you can install. And even the brand new SQL product, the Azure Data Studio, has a whole bunch of, like, you can do SQL Server Agent and SQL Server Profiler, and it actually appears right in this interface. And that set of extensions, there is a, what do you call it? A well-defined templates and protocol to create these. And if you go to Visual Studio Code, there are literally thousands of add-ons that you can get. And here's one that's for C#. You really need that if you're going to do ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core. I have one where I do debugging for websites right within VS Code. This is a little video of what it looks like. This one is for my Vue work. That adds a bunch of extensions for Vue. But there's just a ton of these extensions. You should give them a try. And I do see this is going to be the way a lot of people code going forward. And you know the price of these? Free. So it's all, and in fact, they're both open source. People can go up to GitHub, they can do pull requests, and they can add functionality to it. So hopefully you got some value out of this. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and since I'm over time, questions are over. Goodbye.